So I think we're live now. I am Arlene Montalvo. I'm chapter president of the Riverside San Bernardino chapter of the California Native Plant Society. We welcome those of you online. We have a bunch of people here today in the room. This is a hybrid presentation, so bear with us during the question and answer period. Most of the time it's good to, with our presenter to wait to the end to address questions, and then we need to repeat the questions and say the speaker might need to say the questions out loud so that the people online can hear if the questions come from the audience that's here live. And then Katie will be reviewing questions in chat. So anyway, the California Native Plant Society is a statewide California organization, a nonprofit organization. We have something like, 36 chapters now in Baja California. We have about 13,000 members of CNPS, active members, so we're growing. We have a great publication that comes out, quarterly, the Flora magazine, and then also our journal that has a slightly more scientific bent. But the most recent one is really interesting. It's our journal Artemisia. And the most recent one that came out is the first part of a series on climate change, the indigenous people's perspective, and it's fascinating. So those of you who are members will have received it. If you haven't received it, it's available online. This is a very special issue. So it's being made available to the public online through our cnps.org website. You'll be able to read it in the HTML version, or else, you can also download it as a PDF file. So I encourage people to do so. So one of the main things that our organization does is we try to protect, restore, preserve the native plants and native plant communities, vegetation communities of California. That's just the short thing that we do, but we're trying to be a very inclusive society and bring in many different points of view on how we go about doing this. So we welcome everybody to bring in their knowledge, their points of view, so we can share knowledge and do this better, preserving our native plant community heritage. So we have some programs coming up. Our program schedule is the third Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. We have programs scheduled for the next 2 months, and we're working on a couple of programs for April and May. I'm already in discussion with some people, and I'll be talking to Orcutt about that. We also have a June program, the third Saturday in June, which will be our members program, where we elect our slate of officers for the next 2 years and various sorts of committee members. We may have some not bylaws, but guidelines to approve by the chapter at that date as well. Go over chapter business, but I do welcome participation in giving us ideas for presentations and field trips. We're only just in the field trip planning stage because we still don't have a field trip coordinator, but we have 2 field trips that we're getting ready for. And I think we're gonna probably have one where Rivers and Lands Conservancy staff show us some of their restoration or habitat sites, and possibly I'll put Michael Miramontes on the spot. I think he does want to do this. He may be giving one of our presentations on some of the really cool restoration work that they're doing in the Del High Sands flower-loving fly habitat. And then another program that we're probably going to have, I'll put Becky Levers on the spot. She just gave a really cool presentation at the Redlands Horticultural and Improvement Society the other evening in collaboration with, I can't remember her name, a woman from the Malky Museum, and on indigenous uses and medicinal uses of a bunch of, local native plants. And so we'll try to get that coordinated, co-presentation together for our chapter as well, because I heard really good things about it. And it goes really nicely hand in hand with these Artemisia issues that we're putting out. So I'm going to just remind you that our next meeting in February, on February 17th, we'll be getting the program information out, but that's going to be Ernesto Alvarado, and it's going to be here. It's going to be in person only. This will not be a hybrid presentation because it's a tour of the Riverside Corona Resource Conservation District facility, the nursery facility that Ernesto has really built up, and it's a clean grow nursery, avoiding contamination by Phytophthora root parasites, and they have a new steamer that can be utilized by various other organizations to sterilize soil and pots so that we can have really clean nurseries. There's a facility for storing seeds and processing seeds. And so he'll talk about a lot that's done here in order to collect native seeds to be used in restoration projects, to produce plants and to seed restoration projects, how they're processed, how they're stored, and how they're grown. And so it should be fascinating. And Ernesto is great. So that's going to be on February 17th. That's going to be an RSVP, members first, and nurseries. So if there are local nurseries and growers that would like to come to that program, contact us at rsbcmps@gmail.com, and we'll save you a spot for that because there are only so many people we can accommodate. Okay, so today's program, finally. Today we are honored to have one of our Southern California very special botanists, Fred Roberts. Many of you have seen some great presentations he's given on Calicortus and many other really cool presentations over the years. Today he's going to talk about these seasonal alkali wetland habitats that he has been tracking for many years. He used to do it with a colleague who unfortunately passed away, gosh, 6 years ago, 10 years. Oh. Your colleague.
Oh, yeah. I'll mention it here. You'll get
it. Yeah, you'll hear about it. But so I'm just gonna. So Fred is great. He also is helps us with our rare plant program. He's helped with the listing of some rare plants. I'm just gonna let him start talking. I'm gonna stop. So thank you very much, and Fred.
All right, so this is going to be one of my first hybrid programs I've ever been involved in. And usually if I'm involved in something, there's going to be some sort of technological problem. We've hopefully already gone through that. I almost got to use my Mac on this, but the projector decided it would blink it at all. So we're not doing that. Now, so I apologize to people if I start wandering out of the field because they've actually given me anything here that lets me know where I'm standing. So, so if I just wander off for a minute, you'll know that's part of what it is. Hang on, Orcutt's doing something to me here, but
just showing you your pointer.
Okay.
That's your pointer.
Oh yeah, well, but I think I know how to run those.
And then left.
Yeah.
The left button is your forward, and your back button is up here.
Forward. Hopefully, I don't need to know. Wait.
Forward. Back. I think you can go forward this way too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Hopefully that's most of our technical issues right there. So before I get going on this, just let you know that I have a very long history with some of the Riverside plant communities, and this particular one is my favorite. And just so that we have a good clarification here, what I'm going to be talking about today is actually some specific alkali wetlands in Riverside County. I could have titled the talk Seasonally Flooded Alkali Plants of the Seasonally Flooded Alkali Vernal Plains, but I thought that might be a bit of a mouthful for people, and it's a long title. But that would be more specific to what we're actually talking about today. Now, some of you know, well, actually, most of you probably know that I'm actually have author or the co-author on a book on Western Riverside County plants, vascular plants of Western Riverside County. We're hoping to put out a new edition in the next year or two. We've been trying to, I think we've been saying that ever since 2012. But now I actually have, Scott White has retired from his job. So there's actually more than one of us working on it. So it might actually get done this time. Also, the co-author for wildflowers of Orange County and the Santa Ana Mountains. And well, one of these days I'll have a second oak book out. But the love for vernal alkali plain habitat is a longstanding one for me. And I've approached this community with great passion in the past. However, it's just sort of an honorary thing. I thought I should mention Dave Bramlett. Dave Bramlett is actually the person who really brought the botanical issues of these habitats to the conservation community. There have been a number of people who had worked in the past to try to get some interest in these habitats, but he's the one that actually made inroads with the federal and state agencies and other groups to really start looking at this stuff. Dave started wandering as part of, I think, part of MWD survey projects. He ended up sort of wandering off after the project. Dave's work was done and poking around and started finding some really interesting things. He started looking at these habitats in 1988. And by today's standards, it was absolutely pristine in 1988 to look at these habitats, and just a wonderful place. So part of today's talk is actually going to be focused on what we would like to see in these wetlands as sort of a final result, if we ever manage to get enough of them conserved. There's going to be a lot of it that we've lost over the years. At one point, the Fish and Wildlife Service was looking at conserving a 250-foot wide corridor along the San Jacinto River, which if maybe you've walked along the San Jacinto River, that's just a tiny fraction of the floodplain that was available out there. Actually, I got in a lot of trouble with that because I actually wrote a letter to Riverside County saying that the plan wasn't going to work. And it turned out that one of our Fish and Wildlife Service officers actually had basically co-worked with the thing. And he was on vacation when I did the letter, and he wasn't happy with it. He came back. But I pointed out to him their plan was basically a jeopardy for the San Jacinto Valley crownscale. And my position on that held. And so basically we started working a different process from there. But Dave was an important part of all our early conservation moves after I worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Right from day one, 2 months before I started working Fish and Wildlife Service, he dragged me out in the field along with Wayne Farron, a UCSB famous wetlands researcher. And even though it was November, we could see that there was some really, really important issues out here in terms of species. And even on that day, we were introduced to what Dave Bramlett called the Hemet saltbush, which for many years, we weren't sure what the heck to call the thing. Maybe it was a new species. And since that time, it's gone through at least 3 or 4 different name changes on it. It turns out it actually does have a name. And we've actually been calling it by the right name for years. And it's much rarer than the San Jacinto saltbush in some ways, but it doesn't have the same level of protection. Anyway, you can see it's one picture down below when the lower, see if I guess your lower left, the lower right. Okay, lower right. Yes, okay. I guess I should look at my screen here. I get my left and right backwards all the time. You'd think by now I'd timely sort that out. Anyway, so that's Dave outstanding in some of this habitat and doing what Dave usually did. He's explaining something to somebody in great detail and educating them. And above that is a picture of Dave leading a field trip, probably the Southern California botanist field trip, but it could be a CMBS field trip. So the area we're looking at, since it's the Riverside San Bernardino chapter, most people are pretty familiar with the Riverside area. So I don't need to go to great detail of that, but you can see this area is largely dominated by essentially the Paris Basin. That's the area between the Santa Ana Mountains and the San Jacinto Mountains. And on these aerial images, that really stands out. In my original program, you had to use had a nice photograph of a Landsat image. It was pretty impressive, but of course now today we could just go to Google Earth and bring up an image that maybe not quite as pretty, but it actually shows the detail pretty well. So we're concentrating this area between Paris Lake and Lake Elsinore. Again, as I'd said, the wetlands we're looking at are a specific type of alkali wetland. It really could be the other terminology, the name I could have used for this is would have been the alkali plants of the Willow Domino Travers Alkali Soil Series. I guess that title I didn't think that was really going to roll off anyone's tongue either. If you were involved in rare plants, particularly the federal listing process in the 1990s, this was just sort of a household term for the soils, because turns out, and that's what these areas are marked in red, are the soils that have a assemblage of plants that are very interesting. And interesting enough, some of these smaller areas actually have about the same number of rare plants as you'd find on the Santa Rosa Plateau. But as we all know, the Santa Rosa Plateau gets a lot of attention, and the alkali flats don't get nearly so much attention. One of the challenges with dealing with this habitat and trying to deal with conservation is they don't look like a whole lot. You look at this slide and it's, you're standing up on a hill looking over, yeah, this is actually along the San Jacinto River, I believe. And all you see is this flat grassy area. Looks kind of weedy too. One of the problems we had with dealing with environmental documentation, a lot of documentation from this area, often somebody seems to be out in November and say, well, it's just a big flat grassy field, there's nothing there. And the kind of irony about that was that it's not at all that. In fact, actually, the native density in these areas back in the 1980s and 90s was generally about 80 to 90% native species, and sometimes just 10% non-native species. Even though they looked like weeds, they were not. And again, part of it was the time of year. You're visiting it at the dry season, it doesn't look like a whole much. You see a few sort of barren, scaldy looking areas, and you see a lot of grass. Now, a lot of times it's been mowed or trimmed or something, or recently there's been some dryland farming. So you, again, didn't see much of value looking at it. And then winter rolls around, sky's all darkened, and we start getting rain, and while below, you've got water everywhere. And sometimes it's quite a bit of water standing around. And one of the little magic tricks with these alkali soils is that they tend to form a bit of a crust, a caliche crust that tends to either be impervious to or semi-impervious to water. And anybody who works in the wetland things kind of recognizes that. Well, it's kind of like what a vernal pool does, only these are a much broader area they're working on. And so you end up with any low area tending to pond over the years. And of course, when the water starts retreating and the starts warming up, everything turns green and pretty. And for just a few months of the year, you end up with lots and lots of flowers and stuff. This is, of course, how things were several years ago, or well, a couple decades ago. It's not quite as nice today. We've got little pockets and islands where we still have this sort of thing going on. An awful lot of it has gone some sort of impact in recent years that have made it much more difficult for this habitat to respond and recover the way it once did. Kind of interesting to think that the area had been under dryland farming, well, way into the early 20th century, the 20th century at least, probably the late 19th century. And somehow we got to the late 1980s, 1990s, and still had all kinds of really interesting habitat there. What it really basically said, dryland farming was not really much of an impact on this habitat. And it was sort of an ideal interaction between humans and plants, or at least a balance anyway. Sometimes it was just utterly spectacular in any particular year. This is a Dave Bramlett photo he took on the San Jacinto River, and I believe it's actually in the San Jacinto wildlife area. And sometimes it looks just stunning on certain days out there. There's a photograph of the Hemet area. You were familiar with, there's a little pocket of this habitat on the west side of Hemet. We often called it the Old Salt Creek drainage, Upper Salt Creek drainage area. It's still part of the San Jacinto Valley. And one of the photographs was done for, I think it was, I forgot which company now did it. Recon did a study out there on the vernal pools, and they had a couple of aerials, including the cover, and the entire valley is just Lastinia. It's just yellow. It's beautiful. This is actually the Hemet area. Again, this is showing still that in the 1990s, you got some pretty spectacular flower fields out there. This is one standing up on a hill in Hemet. Now, just for those who know, I actually had this program set up with, I do the programs usually in Keynote. You get some really cool, neat transitions and such. We had to export this to PDF in order to get it to work on a local computer. So I lost all my transitions. So you're supposed to see this nice, pretty picture without things blocking it. And they're supposed to pop up as a second thing, but that's not what you're saying. But you still get a feel for just what the flowers could look like. And I don't think if you were standing on the same hillside today, you'd see something quite as nice. Although the foreground might be, because I believe the foreground is actually part of a conservation area in this photograph. But areas that were not are probably have lost it. But it's really impressive to see these areas at their full magnificence. So back to that map again, looking at it, again, this is our soil. So you can see this also extends up into the Paris Valley. We don't know as much about the Paris Valley stuff. That has been converted pretty much to a more regular agricultural regime, and there's a lot more development. All that was done before 1985. So it's sort of kind of fallen by the wayside. And then down by Hemet, if you look to the alkali habitats also extend fairly far west. The western part of that lower, I guess I forgot I have my cursor here. I can show that, can't I? This little section in here has always been a little bit mysterious. It was still a pretty good habitat, and even up into the early 1990s, but it was not an area that you could just wander around. The folks that owned it planned to develop a major thing. Now, of course, their environmental documentation found nothing interesting out there, which I'm really skeptical about. They probably did a lot of surveys in November and didn't know one salt bush from the next. I'm not sure, but anyway, it probably had a lot of interesting plants in it, but we never really got to examine that. Notice one of the other features up here at the top is Mystic Lake. It's actually a gigantic vernal pool, basically, Mystic Lake. A little bit because the water is in it longer. It doesn't really develop a vernal pool of flora, so to speak, as the water's there too long in good years, but gives you a feeling. So the areas that we're primarily interested in here today, and I'm going to talk about, are Upper Salt Creek, the Hemet Upper Salt Creek area. And this is still flats, around 600 or 700 acres today. And it's actually the best hope we've got for maintaining some of this habitat. There's actually a fair amount of it now is in some sort of conservation. I'd like to see a little bit more in some of the other areas. It got a lot less impact in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s than the San Jacinto River area did. And it had some unique species that we don't see over at the San Jacinto River. Is Mystic Lake, which is at the upper end of the complex. And this is largely a willow soils area. And it's a big flat, just light depression. And in any fairly wet winter, it used to fill up pretty well. And then in the super wet winters like 1993, it would actually become a major lake and then have trouble draining. And it had some really interesting stuff. It's been a little under researched. We only kind of have a vague idea, I think, of what really was or is that Mystic Lake. And part of it's been turned into ag off and on, and that sort of disappeared. This is our older, are no longer with us, Corgi Durango, who used to accompany me on all sorts of different botanical expeditions back in the day. We have a new corgi named Pippin, but Pippin isn't really much of a wildernessy sort of exploration type dog. He's more of a city boy. It's like, wait, you want me to step off onto a dirt trail? Like, Pippin or Drango used to go off with me on actual rare plant surveys, struggling through the coastal sage and stuff. He was a little trooper. Anyway, it kind of gives you some of the feel for some of the vegetation you find at Mystic Lake. A lot of the lakeshore stuff, very short annual vegetation develops. Then, of course, Dave's picture fits as a nice complement to the San Jacinto River area. And this is the largest block we have. If I recall, it's about 2,000 acres roughly, extending, including most of the San Jacinto wildlife area and extending down into the Paris region. And there's this little pocket out west that is much more recent in discovery. Again, another Dave Bramlett discovery. I think circa 1994, 1995, it went out, checked up some records near Lake Elsinore and Albert Hill, and discovered there's this whole little microcosm of habitat, again, based on willow soil that had many of the species you find over in the San Jacinto River. Of course, I think they're still there, but this area has less protection than even the San Jacinto River. It gets a lot of impacts. It's got a couple of interesting peripheral species. For example, San Diego ragweed. Is it San Diego ragweed? Anyway, Ambrosia pumila, which is found more commonly in San Diego County, occurs in a couple of spots in Riverside County, including this one. If you're in Baja California, it does occur along alkali lake boundaries and stuff, but we don't see it as often doing that in the United States. But there is some over at Nichols Road. Tenacious little stuff. I've seen that gets dissed and beat up all the time, and it seems to come back a lot. Of course, if you pave it, that'll finish it. And then it turns out that, or a little isolated patch out in the Murrieta area, Skunk Hollow, the base of that vernal pool is actually willow soils again. So it's still related to the whole San Jacinto area. Now, this photograph here is actually shot back in 1994. So there's no development around it. I kind of thought it would kind of been fun to throw in a more recent picture to show how this pool is still there doing fine, but kind of surrounded by development now, which may alter the way that it goes off into the future. This photo or image here, what I'm trying to show you here is that here are the four major components of the soils that are associated with these alkali basins. The two prominent ones are willow soils and domino soils. But it really appears to be, we also have chino soils, a little bit at Hemet, which don't play a huge part in this, but they've got a reasonable number of rare plants on them. So we have included them in the bunch. And domino seems to have a little less in terms of the rare plant diversity that we find. And like 70 to 80% of our rare plants are really going to be mostly on the willow or willow soil. And Traver actually plays a pretty good part too. There's and we see a lot of the rare ones on Hemet out in the Traver soils, but not as much up the upper San Jacinto Valley. But it's kind of hard. The upper San Jacinto Valley is a little tricky because so much of it had been altered before we started really looking at it. That's hard to know for sure what's going on. You had, again, areas planted for sod. You had dairy farms and all sorts of things that's going on up there. So lots of alterations. So a little bit here about why we have this interesting area out here. Historically, this is a low spot. So as the years have gone on and water's coming off the San Jacinto Mountains, et cetera, a lot of the silt ends up being dumped and just sort of stops in this general area. And at one point, it was probably even more of a basin area, and you got the silt buildup. And then things probably dried out a bit. I don't think that whatever drove having this giant basin structure is quite the same one we have today, but we ended up with big, basically bathtub bottom of alkali soils. And I used to know how deep they ran, but I don't actually know that today. This is a picture of Mystic Lake, I believe, when it's actually got a pretty good amount of water in it. And the San Jacinto Wildlife Area is that area on the left of the image there. And you can see a lot of it is underwater. This is 1993 when we had one of our largest recent flooding events. An interesting correlation is shown here, where you can see that along the San Jacinto River from south of the Ramona Expressway down to Nuevo, you can see that the willow soils are here shown in a red, actually sort of orangey red on my screen. I don't know what it looks like on other people's screen. And if you look at the winter floods of 1993, they almost exactly match the willow soil layout. It kind of tells you a little something about the association of the soils and the importance of flooding that are around it. There's been various efforts to look at how the flooding and water hydrology affect the rare plant things. We had one school of thought this, most of the water you've got out there is coming off the surrounding hillsides and stuff. And so the flooding's not that important. We can go ahead and put a big dam up and stop the whole thing and put houses there. Or we have the other school of thought is that the flooding itself is actually really critically important to maintaining this habitat, that it has it's not only that it allows water, but it also has basically a restorative element to it. That is that essentially that you could take something that's a bit of a mess and you clean it all up, kind of like rebooting your computer, basically. That's a good example where something stops working as nicely as it used to, push that reboot button, everything's great again. Well, that's what these flooding events were doing on these things. So no matter what people did do it in the past, when they were doing their sort of low-grade impacts to it, this reset would basically put the habitat back into order again. So, and the other interesting thing on here is you see there's a purple line on. You're showing the 100-year flood modeling. This is probably circa 1994. I don't know if the water district has updated these maps and changed their idea. I know at various times in the past they wanted to make the river itself a little deeper and therefore knock that line down to a little straight line, which would really be hard. One of the reasons when I was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service that we spent so much time on the San Jacinto River working on trying to maintain the floodplain. It was critical to have this flooding, and any kind of flood control you do that usually helps structures downstream is going to really mess up that floodplain hydrology. This is that same area just to the north of it. That's the Ramona Expressway running through the middle of this. This again showing 1993, showing that just how much of this area had flooded and at that time. There was actually a pretty significant flood in 1995, a couple of years later as well. I should put that picture, that San Jacinto Wildlife Area is everything north on everything to the right of the Ramona Expressway. This is the Ramona Expressway here. So that area also had that extensive natural flooding. Even after the waters receded, I had this nice photograph I bought when I was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, because the Fish and Wildlife Service didn't really have the money for it, or didn't have it loose, and you had to go through enough permissions to make it all the way up to the White House in order to get an aerial photograph. So I just bought the thing and photographed it. And it shows here, you can pretty well see where the flooding events took place in 1993. Again, that's pretty much almost exactly marking the willow soil, showing that real character, that real association between flooding and the habitat that we've got in here. This is lower in the San Jacinto River area. This is what we called the ponding area, just north of the 215. And it was a large, extensive flat area, which at various points have been proposed to be a giant basin. And other elements, once again, to get it dry enough that we can start building things here. And the main reason why we still have this area today to work on is because of the flood risk out there. There's still a good flood risk, and that's kind of keeping a lot of things out of it. However, that may be keeping buildings out of it, but it doesn't keep other things out of it that have caused other incremental things. But then you see how extensive that one pond area is. That some of you may have recognized that there's a lake I think this is Nuevo, I think, and I can't recall the road that's here. But there's a lake system or little reservoir system probably related to sanitation or something. I don't think it's actually a water reservoir there. But you can see the interesting patterns and such going on down in this area over here. And these all kind of work out to be sort of natural scalds and stuff like that. Areas that have been lightly impacted by agriculture, mostly wheat, barley and wheat, can change a little bit every year, but they're not necessarily terribly affected at this point in history. Just out of curiosity, let's know how big the water event was in 1993. There was a pretty good sized one in 2005 also that really drove a lot of changes. That those years they're like the super blooms for the San Jacinto River. So by comparison, we had a lot of water last year also, and you think, ooh, that must have gotten us some really good flooding out there. But I didn't see any evidence that they had real standing water in huge amounts. In fact, here's a very clever way of using Google on your side thing. You'll see that it's actually the same area shot in using a Google shot in the oblique feature and showing it in last year after the rains and largely exceeded. There are evidence of areas that were fairly wet, but there's no sign that there's any long-stand ponding. In 1993, the water was still there in May. So that's a long time. Sometimes the water would stay for 4 months. And that's why it's got that restorative quality to it, because you'll flood out and drown all the seeds you don't want. And the seeds that you do want, well, they're used to, this happens periodically and they just get really wet. And it, scatters and spreads around and such like that. So it's a huge way of getting rid of weeds. The other thing it does is it the actual, the flow is usually relatively slow through here, but it still tends to smooth out the bottom a little bit. So if say someone has this, after it's really flooded, that the mounds tend to sink and drop down a little bit. And again, the water sits for a long time because the soils tend to be impervious. Now, one of the things that happened in 2023 that make it a little bit unfair was now there's been a lot more impacts to the soils, the actual soils themselves in these flooded, in these habitat areas, which didn't happen in the 1980s and 90s. We've actually changed some of the soil chemistry. We've changed the way the soils respond to stuff. We've actually broken up some of the clays and alkali soils a bit. So the water doesn't actually stay on the ground. Even if you had the same amount of water, it's much more likely to soak in than it used to be. So it's possible that 2023 rains were cheated because the soils were no longer the same and it just couldn't hold the water the same way it used to do. Here's showing the Ramona Expressway after the 1995 winter, which again was a pretty wet winter. Again, showing just how many of these areas are underwater for a while. So you come back later in the spring and they are really, really interesting botanically. On the same boat, if you have a dry winter, you don't have any water, nothing much happens in the spring. There's a few exceptions to that rule, which I'll talk about here shortly. This is over in the Hemet area, looking down from one of the hills. This is actually the EMWD preserve on the west side of Hemet. And it just was like a real clue that we managed to get that. That little pocket, I think it's 40 acres. It's either 20 or 40 acres. It just has some wonderful plants on it. Including the Parsis saltbush, which is pretty much known from almost like 3 locations. And that's it. Why it's not federally or state listed is a little hard to figure out at this point. But if it weren't for this preserve, that plant would be almost certainly extinct. Except for I guess they have one preserve in San Diego that helped too. Kind of interesting. Again, this is showing we've got broad areas of flooding and the water sits for weeks, if not months sometimes, in winter years, and that just makes a real difference for these habitats. I had to throw this in because this is the newer corgi, and he's a very happy corgi. He's extremely social, doesn't do well with fireworks, but boy, he loves everyone. So the vegetation, this is again the seasonally flooded alkaline vernal plain habitat. Here, I actually wrote it out, so now you can guys see that if I'd used this for the title, it would have, been long. And also, since this is relatively still, I'm not always organized in the morning. I was afraid I couldn't say it unless I had my coffee. So that wasn't a problem when I was 50, but I'm finding it getting increasingly talking is getting harder to do these days. Anyway, so we have 4 primary habitats that are in this area, and that's the alkali scrub, the alkali playa, sometimes called an alkali scald, alkali annual grassland, and alkali vernal pools. And again, alkali vernal pools are a little tricky because where's the line between an alkali vernal pool and just a regular vernal pool? There may not really be one. They're pretty similar, but we note that these vernal pools are on alkali soil, so we call them alkali vernal pools. They usually have a few things you don't see in standard vernal pools. Alkali scrub is, well, basically a scrub habitat, often mixed with grass, but sometimes relatively dense, has kind of a coastal sage scrub sort of look about it when you glance at it, but it's almost entirely made up of plants like sea blight, and it's lower than coastal sage. You're not going to have any of these problems about walking through it, or you're not going to smell much like a sage for your cat when you get done either. You might smell a little like a cat box, but the primary constituents of this habitat are like swada, nigra is a big component, Frankenia salina is a component, Atroplex argenta, and then there's that horrible name at the bottom, which unfortunately I can't remember the common name for half of these things. That's what happens. You be too hardcore a botanist. That sea blight is the swada, and Frankenia is alkali something. Oh, I can't remember. And was that alkali heat? There we go. See, that's a lot easier to say than Frankenia salina. And although the problem with common names, sometimes we cheat those, like eucalyptus. That's just the genus of a tree, and we're lucky that they don't call it alkali Frankenia. But then down at the bottom is the one that I wish I could remember the common name because I hardly can say the Latin name. It's yeah, I have trouble with that one. A subterminale. Interestingly enough, that's the plant on the far right, and the type location for Arthracnum subterminale is actually on the San Jacinto wildlife area. But there's only like the last time we looked, we found like maybe there's like 4 or 5 dozen plants out there. It's really scarce. One of those plants that don't do well with disking and habitat modification. It's still fairly common in coastal areas, so I think of it really as an alkali plant along like say Newport Back Bay or something. But now, sure enough, we've got it out here growing in the San Jacinto wildlife area. What was that? Pickleweed. Well, it's one of the pickleweeds. Yeah. But pickleweed's complicated because they've broken that up into 2, sometimes 3 genera. So although that's our sort of our misery of the day is that it's actually gotten to the point where the Latin names have changed around enough that maybe those common names are far more stable and easier to use anyway. Yeah, for example, I of course we only have part of the audience in the room here, so I can't say that. How many people know the black mustard is no longer the Brassica nigra? Everybody knows Brassica nigra, right? And the new name starts with RH, but it's good that I've forgotten it already because it only lasted for 6 months. It's going to be Mutrata nigra, I think is the name that we're going to end up settling on for that. The true mustards, Brassica, have been a mess for an awful long time. And they finally have broken them up and trying to make our life more miserable. But iNaturalist particularly is excellent about throwing out new plant names that the local botanists have to then sort out and find out if they have any, should we be following it or did they kind of jump the gun on that? Anyway, so alkali scald or alkali playa habitats, if you're going out and look at this habitat, you see these big white patches of soil. These are really heavy clay and probably pretty darn salty too, brackish. So plants have a really hard time growing on them. And they're so bad for growing things that you'll find that in dryland farming operations, even if they try to get rid of them, they come back. Or you try to grow anything on, the wheat doesn't want to have anything, or barley doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So that a lot of times they actually would avoid the stalls when they're doing their farming activities. So they tended to survive a little better than some of the other habitats did. And they really look like there's nothing out there on them for much of the year. But it's again, one of those tricks about this habitat where it's got its moments where suddenly these seemingly nothing on it areas will have stuff. There's another example. This is a playa out in the middle of the alkali scrub habitat. Actually, the stuff in the far background, I think it's mustard infringing on this particular area out here. So you can kind of date the photo a little bit by how many exotics are in the photo. If it's early in the period of looking at these habitats, there will be no exotics. I mean, no introduced new species practically at all to be seen. Later you get, the more and more mustard and stuff you find growing in these areas. So here's an example. If you were here when Dave Bramlett was doing his original work and poking around, this was a typical area near the 15 where you can see these scalds are really, really evident. And each one of those are probably just lined with things like San Jacinto Valley crownscale at the time. Nobody really did a systematic look in 1988, so we don't really know. Dave and a handful of other people went out and did a number of plants, enough so that it showed that there was clearly a lot of rare plants out there, but we only have really spotty mapping. This is in that ponding area I mentioned. And you can see the areas adjacent have been dissed at some point and stuff planted on them. That doesn't mean those habitats were gone. They were still something that could show up and be used. And at the lower left of the screen, there's this little triangular block here that for years and years, when everything else was going on in the San Jacinto River, this area remained pretty much untouched, and it was becoming the gem of the San Jacinto River area. It only took one manure dumping, and that took care of that. It, hardly has anything. Now there's this little strip along you can actually see it in this photo. There's this little rectangular strip. This little strip now is oops, what did I just do? Oh, I'm not sure what I just did. Somehow I did something jumping back. Oh, we must be for it. There we are. I saw white out on my computer here. I don't know what that means, but it didn't look good. Anyway, so that little strip down there is now some of the best habitat along the San Jacinto River. And it still gets all kinds of wildflower blooms and stuff after a wet rain. I'm sure it's going to go with the next freeway widening or whatever they're going to put there next. But anyway, that's kind of an interesting area. So this is really one of the more significant discoveries of and interesting parts of this habitat is the annual alkali grassland. If most of you who have botanical backgrounds in school and stuff always learn if it's a perennial grassland, it's a native grassland. If it's an annual grassland, it's an exotic grassland. Well, that's actually turns out not to be true. There are a few spots in California that have annual native grasslands, and we actually have one of them. And at least through 2005, we still had some really nice solid ones. I don't know what their condition is like today, but these are extremely species rich with rare plants and some really interesting more common species in it. And again, to the untrained eye, it doesn't look all that different than one of our fields of European grasses very much. And this is where you run a risk, particularly when we had people doing environmental surveys in the late summer, fall, and winter, which is sometimes still happens a lot, is they take one look at the field and they don't put a whole lot of effort into it. And the next thing you know, it's full of rare plants, but they didn't notice it. One of my favorite stories was Siege 2M Hell took on a project for the Highway 79 expansion. It actually hasn't happened yet, so I guess it's a very slow thing, but it approved highway expansion to the Hemet area. But they allowed us to do some extremely extensive rare plant surveys in the Hemet area, including we were allowed legally to get on private land that people didn't really want us to be on too. In fact, it was kind of fun with the one property where it was erased. They give them notification we're coming out. And darn it, they just have scheduling disking the following week. So we get out and find the whole place that had been disked. And it was pretty fun because we could find the rare plants. Bits and pieces were still on the ground. So we just mapped the bits and pieces. The polygons might have gotten a little stretched as a result of it, but we still managed to get at least some diversity on it. But this area was just stunning when it came to its alkali annual grasslands, and we really came to appreciate them. Another example in a wetter time frame. You just have some of them really interesting looking. lots of Lastenia is just really big in these habitats at the right time of year. Like there's one little patch of Lastenia to look at. Could be very dramatic. It looks like that in the EMWD preserve, and rarely you see some parts of the San Jose wildlife area still doing that. There's a hordeum that just, you can see it almost everything in the photograph is one species here. It's obviously a monotypic population of one of our rare hordeums. This is almost all hordeum intercedens, vernal barley, which I think today is still considered as CPR 3. They've been trying to figure out for years what to do with it. But this is one of the real strongholds in Southern California and other parts of California, like Orange County. You get little spotted little patches of it here and there. Here we've got 30-acre patches, sort of thing. Here's some of the grasses you can find in the annual grassland. I don't have a picture of Alkapuricus cicatus, but it was out there, but not particularly common. One of the best places to find Danthonia Danthenoides, which I think is vernal hairgrass or something of that nature. And then we got Polaris lemoni, and there's the two very similar hordeums. Depressum is not considered rare, and the vernal barley hordeum intercedens is, and they are separated by some relatively obscure, but once you know what to look for, actually not that hard. It's basically the base of the balloon is expanded on one and needle-like in the other, but it throws a lot of people off. Really hard to do in an iNaturalist photo. And of course, really lots of nice, pretty flowers. And some of the most common ones we get out there are Lastenia gracilis and playa, platyglossa, tiny tips, goldfields, and Basilia ciliata. I think it's Great Valley Basilia. Yeah. Then we got the alkali vernal pool habitats, deeper depressions. And the main reason they become vernal pools is they get a whole bunch of species that are associated with them that are associated with vernal pools. So it makes sense to call them vernal pools. There's a couple examples of plants that are fairly common in these. Psilocarpus brevissimus is always considered a major indicator of vernal pools, and it's in all these depressions. And it's got its own relatively common little popcorn flower. Yeah, so I think I've been trying to actually add common names to some of these things so I remember them, because that's why I actually published vascular plants or checklist of origin Riverside County areas, is so I could actually talk to people in English. So if I could look at my book and translate, look at it. Anyway, then a couple of the other plants like Veronica virgina, the Juncus bufonius. Bufonius is pretty much any kind of wet habitat. Myoceras minimus, there's another vernal pool indicator. The Distampsia danthenoides hairgrass is also a vernal pool indicator. One of the more important ones is Navarretia basalis, which is a strong vernal pool count, and that's also a listed species. We find those all the time out there. Yeah, vernal pools, when they're wet out there, were pretty impressive. And back in the 90s, you still had a lot of Eleochris growing along the edges or scattered around. All that disappeared over the last 20 years. We hardly see Eleochris out there. One of the best parcels to see it was something we used to call the Dilworth property in Hemet, which was kept in some of the best first rare plant habitat I've ever seen. The Dilworth also had 25 cows running around on the thing. And so it was clear evidence that cows aren't always the thing that knock things out. He was actually at just the right number of cows to keep that parcel properly clean. And it was funny when we wandered into the thing, this is where the CH2 hill thing I was going to mention came up, was they looked at all these fields and said, well, we've got these big empty agricultural fields. We'll just assign 12 botanists out there for a week and we'll be done. And Dave Bramlett was one of them. And he said, oh, no, you don't want to do that. This stuff is just teeming with rare plants. So they quadrupled their money. Before they were done, they almost needed 10 times as much money to survey the areas they thought they did. It was just, they had no idea what they were getting into. And the Dilworth property was 60 acres. We had 2 parties of 3 people mapping rare plants on the Dilworth property for 3 days, 60 acres. Now, admittedly, CH2 was doing good work. It wasn't just going out there and take a point. We were taking good data and stuff, but still, that's a pretty impressive amount of areas to work on. Then, of course, the pools dry out, and turn into more of a vernal, you can that's where you get them when you're vernal pool vegetation. A little funny thing, it turns out if you're out looking at, particularly at Hemet, is you see all those ponds and stuff are basically acting like vernal pools. The vernal pools didn't know how to stay in their borders. And that was one of the clever things about this habitat is that, particularly like at Hemet, it was really more like a 600-acre vernal pool because the vernal pool indicator species did not stay in the depressions. They were just everywhere. I saw Arlie looking at her watch, so suggesting that I probably should be whooshing a little bit faster, but yeah. Okay, good. So I did not actually time this. I actually designed this program for federal regulators, but so I was hoping they'd actually watch it one day. But anyway, so this is just a little bit of the dynamics for looking at how this stuff works. So on a dry year, you like to see here scald there, and you might have a little bit of navarretia facialis growing at the deepest part of the scald. The Atriplex cornata is more of an upland dry species. It requires the soils more than it was water, so you'll see it growing in fair abundance along the edge of it. And then in a wet year, things flip. You don't hardly see any of the Atriplex at all. It just disappears. But you'll see a lot of the navarretia showing up around these scalds. Basically, the scalds essentially become vernal pools a lot. The water sits there for a long time. And so the edges, you don't see anything much in the very center of the scalds because it's really nasty habitat condition. And even the weeds don't like it sometimes. So you get this sort of dynamic where flooding and all takes different. Like for now here, look at the same pool. We've had a couple of dry years in a row. And what happens is the navarretia is gone. And you see more of the Atriplex, but then in comes the alkali scrub. The perennial shrubby things start growing into the area. And if it stays dry longer, the alkali scrub then takes over. So the alkali scrub is really a climax vegetation in this area. And without the flooding, it would just cover everything. And you wouldn't see as much in the way of the rare plants and stuff anymore. Kind of like chaparral, when it reaches its climax, you've actually got less species diversity than when it's expanding into this thing. And then a flood year comes along, floods everything out, and we end up basically starting over again. And now we have no Atriplex shows up. We've still got navarretia, and then we get some funny things like this trichocoronus brodiaea popping up, which only is the wettest areas. That cycle happened, at least historically, usually 3 to 5 years between flooding events, sometimes a little longer on it. And we'd do this reset every 3 to 5 years. So it happened a couple times during a decade usually. Now, people may have noticed that we haven't really had a whole lot of flooding since that nice event in 2005. Wow, that's almost 20 years ago now. How did that happen? Well, we might have another feature starting to get involved here, which is causing us might be a little harder to work around. So, looking at a bit of a threat level here. Of course, disking is one of the #1 things we dealt with for years. We have folks that disc for fire control, but disc the entire property when you only need to disc 30 feet along the road. We have disking for making it better for plantings. And we have all kinds of reasons for disking. And the disking in its own was not the worst thing that could happen out there. It's really hard on perennials, though. Something like brodiaea filifolia, threadleaf rhodea will not persist in disking. Neither will alkali scrub. Turns out that sea blight doesn't do well when it's disked either. But some of the annuals don't care as much about it, and they would actually survive it. So, but it has an effect in the long term. So like here's this little diagrammatic. Now we've thrown brodiaea filifolia in, our federal and state listed species growing up there nicely. You're basically in the same circumstance. After a first wet spring following a disking event, you kind of recovers a little bit. And they'll basically let it sit around for 3 or 4 years and it'll almost fully recover. But if you go out the second year or if it's second disking event that same year, which started happening a lot more often, you start changing the scald pattern a little bit. You start seeing some of the species disappear. The first thing that goes is the brodiaea. You don't see it anymore. The Atriplex is still there and the navarretia is still hanging out. But if you get it again, or a year or two later, basically you haven't let it recover, things start switching and changing, basically start losing habitat that way. That always used to be our biggest concern, unless you're thinking of putting a warehouse on it, which has become a more recent concern. And this just shows a little fuzzy on our one in the room, but it should be better on the screens at home. Showing a little of the dynamics of Atriplex, the different colors showing different survey years. They weren't all level, all surveys weren't done at the same level, but you get a feeling, particularly looking at the biggest blob, is those areas were looked at in 3 different years, and they came up with 3 different, entirely different attributes distributions. And that's pretty much how a lot of these things worked out there, is that one year you had a few, the next year you got tons. So you pretty much had to time it right to get the right stuff. When we did the surveys out in Hemet, 2005 to 2006, it was perfectly timed. We probably got the absolute best results you can get for surveying. And I'll go through a couple of the rare plants here just briefly. We have, well, I didn't get the common name on this one. Which one?
Smooth tar plant.
No, smooth tar plant, yeah. Now, the other problem is I don't hear as well as I used to either, so it takes 3 people to tell me what it is. But anyway, this is a species that's a little bit it's disturbance tolerant, so it's one of the species that's done better over the years. We found a few places where they had basically tilled the fields for dryland farming, and then 700,000 central media pungens came up, and that's always pretty impressive. And it's probably going to be a survivor out there, no matter what happens out there. If it's got someplace it can hang on to, it'll do. It's basically a sort of a spiny aster, little or stiff-leaved, actually more than spiny. Has a lot of petals or a lot of legules on the flower and such. It's basically a late summer, pardon me, a late spring, early summer plant. There's another one, Denandra paniculata, San Diego tar plant, which I don't think I have a picture of here, that we found was quite common back in 2005. I don't think it was well known out here. And it tends to grow fairly abundantly to disturbance. Then here's Coulter's goldfield, and it is one of the native areas for it. It's actually gotten pretty widespread in horticulture now because it's often spread around as one of our native wildflowers. So it ends up in a lot of gardens now. But out there, it's basically a wetland plant that's often responsible for some of these big fields. The picture of the San Jacinto River I showed with all that yellow, that was all Asthenia glabreata coulteri. They're just delightful plant when it gets going. It requires a fair amount of water though, so it's not the one that's going to show up in the dry year. If you see it, like, oh, there's the picture. If you see it, it tells you the area is wet at some point in the year. Kind of this interesting little thing here showing it. The one on the dilabrata has a relatively large fused calyx, whereas the filaries are fused, whereas on Gracilis, the common goldfields that we have across most of Riverside County, they're actually free. And the two commingle out there, making it difficult sometimes to do mapping. This is one of my favorite plants out there. This is Wright's Trichocoronis rhytii, a weird distribution. Texas, a little bit across to Mexico and Texas, a little bit across the border into Mexico and Texas, Central California and Southern California. In the 1993 Jepson, they for some reason speculated it was non-native. You know, we don't have many plants that go Texas, California, and such, but we convinced the author that it was a native one. It's been recorded in California since 1840, I think. Seems really early to have one of these things get into the state. And the other thing is, it doesn't behave at all like an aggressive exotic. It just sits and disappears most years. In fact, unless it's really wet, we don't see it all. And then we might not see it for, in fact, actually, I don't think anyone's seen it in Southern California since 2011. So the last time it was seen was, you know, more than 10 years ago by anyone in Southern California. And unfortunately, one of the best places to see it was along an MWD canal. That's where Dave Bramlett first found it. He's the one that brought it to everybody's attention, where it was growing along the leaky pipeline. When MWD fixed their pipeline, that population disappeared. There's still one over on San Jacinto wildlife area where I got these photographs. And but nobody's actually found it for a while. Somebody told me that they went out looking for it pretty diligently last year, and they just couldn't find it. I thought last year would be a good year to find it. But you know, again, this requires rural ponding. It lives in the same habitat you find up in the Central Valley, and we have a number of species like Arthropox cornata notatior has a sister taxon, cornata cornata, that lives in the same habitat in the Central Valley. So it makes sense that the plants in Southern California, we got migratory birds. They're bringing muddy feet and seeds with them. This is the sort of the center of attention for the San Jacinto Valley. And Hemet, this is San Jacinto Valley crownscale. Doesn't look like a whole lot, but if you like Atroplex, it's a beautiful plant. Pretty much found in western Riverside County, and that's its global distribution. Uh-oh, it's actually a 1B. It's not a 21B. I think this is what happens when you boilerplate things over. I'm making a new rank for the state here. And this is actually my favorite little sawbush. She doesn't look any prettier. In fact, it's not nearly as pretty as the other one. Davidson one, it's kind of a challenging history because this was Dave Bramlett's Hemet saltbush, which somebody pointed out, I think it was Dean Taylor said, I think it's Atroplex pacifica, and that name stuck for a few years. Then Craig Reeser found somebody who said, they think it's actually Atroplex Serenina davidsonii, but Dave Bramlett looked at it and said, boy, this is a different species from Serenina, which is a tall annual, which smells like no one's business. And this has no smell at all by comparison. They're clearly two different species. They get lumped together in a lot of taxonomy things, and nobody ever tries to split them. And then a researcher from Mexico was trying to do some work, and she said, you know what, I think it's just Atroplex culturi. So you can find it under all three names in various things. In fact, it showed up that way a little bit in some of the Riverside's Western Riverside habitat conservation planning, kind of a mess. But it's Davidsonii, and for a long, long time, we were trying to debate whether it was entirely separate. Was it even Davidsonii? And then in 2017, I found it on a coast in Orange County. That's where it's supposed to be. That's where it had been known historically. It had not been seen in mainland Southern California for 85 years by 2017. There was still some population down on the island. And we brought this into to Andy Sanders, and he looked and said, yeah, these are definitely the same. They're possibly different subspecies or varieties, possibly, but nobody's really looked into that. But that's kind of an interesting find. And this is really, really sporadic out there. It makes San Jacinto San Jacinto crownscale seem almost weedy by comparison, because there's about probably 100 to 200 times as much attributes of the listed one as you find this thing. But it got caught up in that various habitat conservation plans. Probably should actually have a listing, but we keep hoping that plans will protect it adequately enough. There's another one that's really rare. This is Atroplex parisiae, which was found over on the MWD Reserve by Dave Bramlett again in 1994, I think. At that time, for about that same time, it was found over in Winchester by Craig Reeser, but no one's ever seen the Winchester one again. There's a collection, so we know it existed, but we could never find it again. And then I think around 2005, it was found under Ramona grasslands. So the two dots on the California map here, that's its global range, 2 spots pretty much. It's a little bit more extensive. That upper dot is basically spread over many of our alkali soils, but it's a pretty rare plant. And it's very cute. It gets sometimes as high as 3 inches tall. Apparently, it's a very favorite iNaturalist target. I know at least one person who spent 4 weeks trying to get access to get into this thing because he had to have it on his iNaturalist thing. That's James Bailey, if any of you know him. He's a very determined iNaturalist guy. He's actually got more species than anyone else on the planet by double. So I think he's got 8,000 species listed. The next runner-up has 4,000. We haven't taught him how to recollect plants yet because he finds some really good stuff. But he's definitely in the generation of we document everything by photo. Brodiaea texana, which I had to use one of Dave's pictures because I still haven't found this plant anywhere. It's not very common in Southern California, but it's pretty widespread in Southern North America. Mudnema, this is one thing you find up at Mystic Lake and such. It's been found more widespread in Southern California since these days. That's when it was pretty much known largely out at the San Jacinto River area. And these days it's in the family Namaceae. If people are used to it in Hydrophalaceae and Boraginaceae, now it's in Namaceae. Navarretia of the South. Oops, I think spell check decided that we should have fossils. I kept constantly having that problem where spell check was changing all my stuff, and I didn't always catch it. Fossalis, it has got an extra I in it, spell check. Get your act together. Another vernal pool plant over at Hemet, where the Stowe vernal pool used to be just an absolutely stunning pond that people have known since the early 90s. You would get hundreds of thousands of these plants growing. Unfortunately, that's taken a lot of impacts between grazing and and disking, and you don't see that kind of density anymore. Scattered along the San Jacinto River. This one you only find over at Hemet. For whatever reason, at least in the last 30 years, it's not really been found along the San Jacinto River. Perhaps historically, before these started impacting, it was little mouse tail. It's actually Monoceros minimus variation apis. I religiously usually put that variation on it because I tend to recognize that. I forgot it in this little case. Little tiny, tiny buttercup. Vernal pool plant, very, very vernal poolish. Orcutt californica, another Hemet specialty you don't find on the San Jacinto River, known from one pond out there. That's the Stowe Vernal Pool. In that foreground, in that habitat shot, that's all Orcutt in the foreground there. The Orcutt is has a lemony smell. It's neat little things, and it usually showed up in the Stowe Pool about once every 3 to 8 years. So it's really hard to survey for that stuff. It's just very, very sporadic, usually tied to the wetter years. And brodiaea fulifolia, more of a San Diego County plant, but we've got our populations out here along Davis Road and south of or just east of the headquarters at the San Jacinto Wildlife Area. That's a typical habitat for it in on the San Jacinto Wildlife Area, open clay and stuff. It doesn't look anything like the habitat we find it down in San Diego County, where it tends to be more of a hillside plant there. And some of our threats that we've got, well, disking is the one that we dealt with for many, many years. And that photograph pretty much shows up what the problem with disking is. You churn up the soils, you break up the horizon, and we've got any big plants like perennials, like bulb plants like brodiaea, or we've got shrubs, they just go. But some of the annuals do all right with that sort of thing, and they can survive it as long as it just happens sporadically. We've got grazing, which is less an impact out there to the plants than some of the other things out there. But we discovered, particularly when I got these photographs of the Stowe Vernal Pool. Well, that's not Stowe Vernal Pool. This is grazing somewhere else. There's no lake behind that. That's Stowe Vernal Pool. Actually, I'm not quite sure exactly where I shot that now. But in the Stowe Vernal Pool, though, we saw that they were tearing up and eating the endangered grass. So they are actually still a risk. They do a lot of trampling, and then what we've come in as they're dropping things out there. At Hemet, yeah, particularly draining is a big issue. That's not so on the San Jacinto River because there's enough of a slope there, and no one's put a big canyon in the ground. Well, okay, the San Jacinto River channel is sort of a pit in the ground, but directing flooding. And back in the late 1970s, I think, or very, very early 1980s, it was an agreement with the Hemet Auto Mall that they would build this drainage thing, partly because the folks doing the dryland farming didn't like Hemet because it was too wet to do their dryland farming. So they drained it. And it was amazing how that changed the altered hydrology. They dropped the water table a notch and took it out of the range. And it was still in the early 1990s. It was a really wet place, but it dried out a lot. And I suspect that this is one of the main reasons it's capturing a lot of the water that otherwise spread out over the plain. I don't actually remember why I had that in, so we're gonna skip that. Yeah, maybe the channelization. Yeah, that's probably what I was showing. That had not, oh yeah, because there's a really steep line. That's what was the intention of bringing that 100-year floodplain. And I think it's still the hope today by the flood controls. Flood control people, that's their job, controlling floods. And they're not quite as happy with the idea of letting it spread out for habitat because you want to keep it as structures. But that's where they wanted to reduce the 100-year floodplain to a line. And that's not going to be very helpful for keeping habitat. You can get too much water in an area where the water tends to sit too much. Like if you need deeper channels and stuff, the water just sits. We generally don't get a lot of these rare plant species developing. And we get things like bulrush and stuff filling in and making the borders dim. Of course, we've got exotic species. This was a nasty one out there. It wasn't too big a problem by the early 2000s, but it started creeping in. We had an ally with the Dilworths when they said, they hate this grass. The cattle can't eat it. So they're trying to get rid of it too. One of those rare events where everybody was on the same page. It tends to take over the alkali grasslands. It looks pretty much and has been called by people the wrong name. This is Brodiaea marinum versus murinum, which is the more common widespread thing. These very nice feathery. It's a beautiful grass with dew on it. Then we've got, well, I didn't get my picture in Siphon and OL. Well, I probably have too many pictures anyway. So then starting about 1998, this is a view out of an airliner coming back from probably South America, noticing these patches on the ground here. This was the opening salvo for manure dumping. And so at this point, it was a very small thing, but it didn't last. It didn't stay small very long. This is showing, well, I didn't put this in the right order. All right, we can skip the next slide. But this shows that by December 1980 to 2003, this is a Google image. You can kind of see this looking on the image. You can kind of guess where the dumping was. But by December of 2003, they had dumped a huge amount of manure out there. And you can see the blue spots are showing areas where Navarretia basalis is where the dumping is. And then a much more delicate brodiaea folifolia green dots, or some of those are right smack in the middle of some of these patches they were working on. Not at all good for our habitat out there. This was supposed to be first. It was when I first noticed the manure dumping out there on the ground. Was actually a year later when I saw along the 215, and I noticed that these areas were impacting brodiaea and such. So the immediate impact when you do the manure is that you're basically adding an extra layer of stuff on top of your disking. In fact, they just bury stuff sometimes, but this is really organic stuff. And it turns out, it's also somewhat acidic. And so we're countering it. It's like dropping Alka-Seltzer in your stomach when you don't like when you're having, well, it's the reverse process of that. But essentially what it does, it changes the soil chemistry and tends to mess up the alkali stuff. And so it's really bad for alkali plants to have manure dumped on it. Because I'm just showing it. If anyone want any evidence that the manure and Atroplex were mixing together, here's where some of it's been dumped on the plant. That fine stuff is great mixed up in the garden. Does the same thing to natural habitats. It'll turn your alkali soils into a much friendlier habitat for other things. And there's one of the pools out there are, it's sort of lost its clarity. It's got this kind of yucky look. It's got an orangey touch. It's full of organics. The wrong type of fairy shrimp in there too. We have the common fairy shrimp. There are a couple of places that had the rare one. We were looking for the rare ones, but we never found them. But by the time this got in, we're messing everything up out there. And again, although this one particular area has never really been habitat in our days, that's south of the 215, but it just shows the massive scale of this. Like a 40, 60 or 70 acre parcel just loaded with manure. Everything in that photograph has had manure on it at some point on it. It's really hard on habitat. And, again, you can kind of see why. This does not look like our usual alkali habitat at all. It kind of looks ugly. And when it's wet, it's a real mess. And so what happens when we improve the soil here? We basically set up for weeds. Before we had a situation where 90% of the plants were natives. It flipped. And today, in many of these areas, it's now 90% non-native with a little bit of native stuff surviving on. Ironically, Atroplex coordinated notatia is one of those that tend to hang on. So it's one of the tough little plant, but very bad for our diversity up there. The other thing that happens, as I mentioned earlier, that we could recover these habitats in about 3 years. When you start dumping manure on, now we're looking at 10, 20, 30 years to recover this habitat if you don't have anything else bad happen. And you still need the flooding. Where's our flooding? Okay, we're not getting much help from Mother Nature here. A couple of good floods along this area would help a lot, but what's happening? It's drying out. So that's not helping a bit at all. I'm sure the natural habitat could have done fine with less major flooding if it weren't disturbed as much. But if you're going to make a big mess of it, you need the flooding to be, it becomes absolutely critical to wash some of this stuff out. Of course, it's not like they want it dumped into Lake Elsinore either, but yeah, again, Arlie and I were out watching these guys moving stuff over what was had previously been a very, very nice patch of alkali habitat. Down near Paris, this area, I think, is actually in the area they're starting to put warehouses in. So I guess it becomes irrelevant that they dump manure on it, but yeah, there's a nice fields of manure. However, there's some positive things going on. One, the MSHCP did actually come through. There's a lot of areas that are now being conserved out there that weren't previously. And in theory, anyway, now that they're becoming conservation areas, we'll adopt things like disking and dumping stuff on them. And they'll actually have that opportunity to recover. I have a fair amount of confidence habitat can do a lot on its own if we just give it the opportunity. Of course, it wouldn't hurt to have a little weeding done periodically, but there's usually not a whole lot of money for that sort of thing. I actually think it would be fun for this DMPS chapter, if I ever get my head together, head up an expedition and have some things going, a little bit of rare plant mapping out there, work out with the county a deal to go out and just, because they're never going to have the money to do proper surveys of a lot of these areas. And it would be an interesting thing to follow Orange County chapter's lead on that. We did that with the El Dorado fire a couple years ago, and it's a lot of work, but it actually is can be a good way of having citizen science interaction and be helpful for conservation areas. And you see some of the habitat actually is kind of surviving out there. We've still got some scalds, and we've still got some of the native species starting to pop back in. There's still a lot of non-natives out there. There's a lot more tumbleweed out there than there used to be, a lot more goosefoot, for example, and a few other things like basia, which we don't want, but it's recovering. Then there's also, for example, this is again just south of the Ramona Expressway, River Park. I think it's River Park. I looked up the name. It used to be River Walk, I think, but they've been moving the name around, and I didn't get a chance to coordinate with anybody, find out what's exactly happening. Was that? Yeah, well, I think they changed the name of it because I had all kinds of slides and stuff. I talked about Riverwalk, but I haven't been in contact with Felix much. They were actually hoping to mostly work with Dave Bramlett and I, but after Dave passed, we sort of lost connection with the project. I guess they really wanted Dave, but so some of the stuff you can see here is it looks a little messy, but that's actually good messy. They've been out doing weeding, and they did a little bit of refiguring of the channels and such, and there's some pretty good chance, talking to some of the Fish and Wildlife Service people, they have really high hopes that it's going to actually be a successful mitigation. The weeds are apparently the biggest problem to deal with, but the weeds, you know, how tenacious they can be. Give them a little habitat and they take about 12 miles. And I think that's about it. So anyway, I'd like to see us get back to a position where we start seeing more of this along the floodplains again. There's two opportunities still at Hemet, and we still have the opportunity at the San Francisco River to improve a lot of this habitat. And it wouldn't happen right away. It might have to wait another decade or even 2 decades to start seeing some of this, but I think there's still a good chance of that. And I think that's all I had. All right.
Turn the lights on so we can see.
Great. Thanks very much, Fred. That was really super. And good to see that there's at least some positive outlook, but really interesting. Let's see, I do have a question in the Q&A. If you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. I'll also check for questions in the chat, but let me start with this first question from Aaron Hamill.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
just for you, just to point out, a lot of times I do these presentations, if people want to know how I got my nice t-shirt, I just let them know I have that you can actually order things like these shirts online with my art business, which is my other life. All right, but I always just like throw that in rather than trying to be I'm terrible at advertising my stuff, but try to do a little bit. Anyway, go on.
Yeah. Maybe we can have you show your t-shirt to the folks online. So the question from Aaron is, have these areas been lost to building and agriculture or invasive species and habitat degradation? And Aaron posted that comment about 10:30.
Basically it used to be habitat degradation was the biggest problem. It's a type of agriculture that really hits it hard if you start irrigating. Some areas have had irrigated growing grass. I don't know what they're growing the grass for exactly, either for turf or for cattle, I guess, one of the two. Probably turf because it stays flat. That type of irrigation is hard because it messes up the soil chemistry again to have constant irrigation, and it's hard on species that actually require a little bit of a dry spell. We haven't seen that much yet in terms of actual outright habitat conversion to warehouses and buildings yet, but some of that is coming. Some of it's in areas we're a little less concerned, but it could still spread across the plains. We've kind of been dreading that happening. Right now, there are some warehouse projects that are probably being built in places they shouldn't. mostly on manure areas that used to have brodiaea folifolia.
Great. Okay, let's see if anybody else has questions, if you want to put those in the Q&A or the chat. I don't have any other questions up right now. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, here comes another
Oh,
question.
there's one, wait,
Yeah,
Art asked you a question.
Here's one from James Boyd. You talk about the willow, domino, traver, and chino soils. Where do those names come from?
That's the, I don't, I'm sorry, you guys can't hear. I forget about the way people in the room here can't hear it for Riverside. You want to know where the names of the soils came from. I'm, not a soil scientist, so I'm not actually sure who comes up with these things. Maybe there's a James Willow who first named the first willow soil. I'm not sure. Sometimes they're named after geologic formations and such. The names are all available. The Soil Conservation Service has some incredible online resources that allow you to look at the soils virtually anywhere in the United States. And so you can see where all this distribution is. They, again, with that, the botanists just usually jump in and use whatever they have it, soils. Like, for example, in San Diego County and Orange, we're always looking for aloe clays because the aloe clays are where like brodiaea folifolia are going to be found and such like that. But I don't know why willows, domino, or traver, if they're people. Chino probably got its soil's name because of that probably originated near the city of Chino, would be my guess. But I can't be sure about that.
Okay. Here's a question from Charles Gibbons. Which agencies could we direct conservation recommendation comments to?
The primary agency has been working with a lot of this stuff is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but some of these species are also state listed species, and they're within preserves and such. That's the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is pretty confusing that we have fish and wildlife and fish and wildlife. We liked it better when they were fishing game. But don't always look to them to be working as well as they could. For example, there's been years of fights on the San Jacinto Wildlife Area, which is a state preserve, and it's good for ducks, but not necessarily all that good for plants. There's been various people working with that. In fact, the Friends of the San Jacinto Valley would probably would have all kinds of things to say about that coordination effort. Fish and Wildlife Service largely has been doing stuff with listing and a lot of good habitat conservation stuff. Some of the stuff that's actually positive today is largely because of a few people like Jim Feed at the Riverside office, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is very, very dedicated to protecting the plants and working in these areas. And Karen Clary Rose, who basically took over my slot at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and actually I think did a better job of preserving these areas than I did. I did a great job of pointing out the science that was needed to protect it. She was better at actually finding the conservation mechanisms. So there is a lot of work on it, but it's the Riverside office of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think it's based in Palm Springs that actually would be the main one on that.
Great, thanks for that, Fred. Here's a question. Any thoughts on how these areas might be regulated under the new waters of the U.S. definitions or not regulated?
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm not used to these hybrid things,
Yeah.
After the audience, if those people were trying, you guys know what's going on. Actually, Arlie has a question over here too. So at some point, so they wanted to know if people are aware of that they've changed the court interpretation of what's a protected wetland has changed significantly in this last few months, and basically knocked out anything you can't steam a boat through. So that kind of makes it rough to protect vernal pools and wet areas. And we don't see a whole lot of boat traffic on the San Jacinto River, so it's probably not considered navigable anymore. But this isn't actually a new question. It goes back and forth. When I was working at the Fish and Wildlife Service back in the 90s, and we had this fight all the time where the U.S. Corps of Engineers did not really want to protect the vernal pools out there, and we were arguing that they should fall under wetland stuff. So it's been a long fought issue, and it's never had an ideal solution. I suspect with the current regulatory environment, it'll even be harder. But on the other hand, I always found that the most important thing with plants was making a lot of racket about them. Even when I worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, they pointed out that federally listed plants do not have the protection of animals. They don't. For example, if you have a gnatcatcher on a hillside, it actually puts the brakes on. They have to survey for them. They get a permit for it. They somehow get a federal regulatory thing, and then they can go ahead and start working on the habitat. Technically, on private land for plants, there is no such protection. They basically acknowledge it's there. They do a little bit to try to relieve the impact on it, but there's the protections aren't the same. That old king owns the land and the animal sort of thing versus the public, sort of thing. And I found it the most effective way. It never stopped me at the Fish and Wildlife Service, even though I didn't have the protective mechanism. You just yelled a lot about it. You made a lot of racket. You waited over and over again. You tried to get people converted. That's the thing. That's where CMPS and people are very important, because you can make a lot of racket, and eventually it gets hard to avoid that. You can protect things even if they're not fully protected. CEQA, the California law, actually is much more key in it. And technically for that one, you don't even have to have a plant that's got a rank in like a CPR rank at all, California Rare Plant Rank. In fact, there's a movement in CMPS right now to essentially expand locally rare plant protections. It's actually taken effect in Ventura County and a couple of other counties, where if you can demonstrate that a rare plant in that county is, even though it doesn't have any official ranking on it, can still be considered under CEQA. It's something to be concerned about and try to avoid as much as possible. You've got to have a fair amount of evidence that's, we didn't just randomly pick this plant up. You've got to have good evidence that's rare. We actually do have a list in the back of the west vascular plants of Riverside County of plants that we thought were locally rare or locally concerned that we developed back in 2004. And it's not been widely adopted, and a lot of people just ignore it, but it's there. That's a start anyway. It's more anecdotal. We never sat down and actually came up exactly with it, but anyway.
I'd like to add to that, and you may have to repeat this for them, but part of that movement is working with general plans whenever cities or counties do general plans to get that rare plant or the local area into that plan anyway. And so that's really citizen getting from someone like Fred what that is, and then getting it into.
Orcutt said, basically pointing out that it can play a big part in the city general plans if someone's willing to make the point about it. It seemed easier back in the 1990s and early 2000s to do this. We had more people around doing conservation purposes. It's hard to get new people involved in this, and the older people, well, they're aging out, and it's getting harder and harder for us to manage all these things at once. But so yeah. Arlie had a question over here. Might as well throw her in here someplace if she remembers what it was. Oh, couple questions. Okay. Oh, I forgot about that.
Fred, can you repeat the questions too? Because the
She's
folks on.
asking it.
Okay, sorry, sorry.
Okay, well, basically her first question was basically she's pointing out that I'm supposed to be leading a field trip here at some point in time, either in April or May. We're trying to pin a date down for it, but we're gonna go out and take a look at some of these areas. We're hoping to do it when there's actually flowers there. It's kind of a conflict because a lot of the rare plants, the best rare plants come up later in the season. The prettiest flowers are earlier in the season. So looking for that balance and trying to figure out how to do that with the total solar eclipse happening on April 8th in Texas. Okay, what's your second question? Ooh, yes, manure spreading.
you have information that we can put together to feed to the state so that they don't suggest that nutrient-rich compost, specific compost is spread along the upland area throughout the state. So that's actually.
I think she's got more statements than questions, but there was a question in there. She was talking about manure dumping and basically with some of the new rules coming out, how CMPS can assure that they take into that the people putting together rules and regulations on manure dumping take into account compost spreading. Okay, compost spreading. I think actually in some of the cases it was compost spreading and not manure spreading. But depending on how you look at it, it can come out pretty similar sometimes. Basically, either one of them are raising the organic components of the soils and changing the soil chemistry and making it nicer for plants that don't like alkali stuff to grow there. Anyway, I don't have a whole lot of specific advice. I got into this around 2005, plus or minus. I tried to get hold of, talk to various federal agencies and stuff. There's a lot of anecdotal information, like for example, our observations that we could see it's having impacts, and common sense it's going to change the chemistry. But there's been very little studies about, and I don't know if there's any studies in Southern California that specifically watched to see what happened when you put alkali stuff in. In fact, I think I was directed to the water quality control board. I don't think I had a whole lot of luck with them, but and that's because everybody else, their problem was no one knew what to do with this. Scratch your head sort of thing. Well, we don't like it, but we're not sure if our regulation covers it or not. So that's one of those sort of odd things.
Who actually regulates this dumping? Is it the county or the state, or at what level?
I think Lori wanted to know who regulates this dumping. And I think everybody that I talked to said, well, it's not us. And that's been one of the problems. It falls into kind of a gray area. I think ultimately the county is or the city is probably going to end at the lead one on these things. Obviously, if you've got an endangered species in it, the state is going to want to be involved. But in theory, but they didn't get very involved when this all started, and I haven't seen them really step in at all. Again, this is where public pressure is important. Just yell a lot and tell everybody we've got a problem. Eventually, somebody might listen. Actually, the one nice thing is the dumpings of compost and manure seem to have scaled back a great deal in the last decade or so. I haven't seen it quite as the same problem. And I think there were some regulations that got into place that said, well, we're overdoing this a little bit and letting people get away with it. Part of it was an economic incentive program. You're not really doing much with your land right now. Hey, tell you what, we'll pay you a bunch of money if you let us dump over here. Maybe some of those programs have gone away. And maybe more of the land is now protected, so we don't see it as much anymore. But yeah, I'm a little rusty on some of these conservation things. I've been doing a lot of work in Orange County for the last 10 years, and it's got me a little fuzzy on San Diego and Riverside issues a bit. They don't usually dump manure on the Orange County parklands, but yeah.
Send it out here.
I guess where anyone else have questions then?
I have a question.
Oh, Stan Spencer is good.
What about on the siphon? Is that having an impact on the airplane?
Yeah, Stan Spencer wanted to know if oncocyphon is being considered and what's the impact on all this stuff. I unfortunately had found this morning this wonderful picture showing this, and then with all of the scramble to get everything out the door, I didn't end up in the program. But the oncocyphon, as many of you know, is kind of that's a stinkwort. That's kind of a special plant. Stink gnat, sorry, maybe that's the other one. Ditrichia, I can't remember, that's the other one, yeah. They're all these stinky plants, and yeah, all of you rub them, they're all really stinky. It was pretty innocent looking little plants that started popping in. Back in the 90s and 2000s, we knew about it as an issue, and it was first really reported in Western Riverside County. Seemed like somewhat of a tame plant. There was some concern it might spread. And apparently one of the favorite things of oncocyphon is this crash and burn wet cycles. It likes it when you get a few extra dry years over a few wet years. And it just exploded as a result of or the way the climate seems to be affected locally, at least in the last 2 decades here. Ideal conditions for it apparently have resulted, and it is expanded in Riverside County like we haven't seen. We're trying to keep it out of Orange County, and it looks like it's already a complete failure. That stuff is even getting into Chaparral now. And a picture I was going to show shows that this stuff, it was spreading up at the top of the granite peaks. It was on the skirting soils, and it was down in the alkali stuff. It grows everywhere. So it impacts and competes with virtually everything, and it can become a solid mass. I cannot imagine, considering the chemical that these things have in it and stuff, that it's not pretty hard on virtually everything under it. And certainly it's competition of stuff that a lot of the native seed plants are just not going to sprout the years that Oncocyphon is there. And it looks like it's going to be absolutely miserable to get rid of. And, it just loves it here. And the worst part about that is you look out, it's kind of pretty. So you're driving on the freeway and you see it's like, oh, look at that beautiful wildflowers out there. It's all Oncocyphon.
Was the March 16th presentation that Chris McDonald was doing? We'll be talking about vegetation, and I'm sure a good amount of time to understand.
Basically, if you want to learn more, Arlie is saying if you want to learn more about Oncocyphon, you're probably going to hear about it at their March 16th presentation. Yeah. Yeah. Focusing on weeds, I guess. Oh dear, I'm gonna need translating on this one. She's soft spoken. Maybe there's a question. In which part? Okay.
That area has them that so, but then next year, we have a new plan here, and so PMCS is volunteering and planting this, 1.17 acre native plant habitat, which is on the, I think it's like the Keno aspect. And as that is done by that, alkali heat, so it's really cool. It's a different form. So the seeds are sort of like along the by the wetland.
That basically boils down to Arlie's statements and questions are like full presentations on their own. I'm trying to remember what she said when she started. Essentially, there's a local park here, and it's signed that it has alkali wetlands on it. And the questioner was wondering if I agreed they're wetlands. In this particular case, I don't know because I haven't been to this site, but there are other forms of alkali wetlands aside from the ones that are grown in these vernal alkali plains. And they're very, very much overlooked in regulatory mechanisms and stuff. I don't think people even really recognize them until about the time I left the Fish and Wildlife Service. So some of these meadows and such, one of my favorite ones was that when I left the Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the local consultants tried to hire me, and they did not want to hire me after they found out I was the one that started pushing that we should start looking at all these alkali habitats as protection. Oh, she's got more questions.
They would be happy to have them.
Okay, I didn't actually hear what she said, so I can't tell you what it was, but everybody laughed at it, so it must have been funny.
She asked if I could dump the manure on the invasive plants.
Can we dump the manure on the invasive plants? I think that that's part of the manure dumping industry. They do a study and find out where the invasive stuff and they avoid it. It's already populated. Let's get it on that native stuff so we can get more exotics in there. I don't actually know they do that. Seems like the audience is running out of questions. Is there any more coming on screen?
We don't have any more questions.
I guess that means we're wrapping this up then.
Thanks to everyone.
About what?
Thanks to
Oh,
everyone.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know what to
opposite.
do here. But thank you, everybody, for
there an
attending.
escape
We're
button?
going to close the program
Oh,
down
there you go.
now. So anyway, hope to see you next time. February 17th, some of you, and then for our March 16th program and so on. Have a good day. Enjoy the rain. Okay, and then I can stop the share.